Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's presentation is being brought to you by the Transportation Learning Network. TLN is a program of the Upper Great Plains Transportation Institute at North Dakota State University and is a partnership with the 4 state DOTs of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming, and the Mountain Plains Consortium, which is comprised of 8 universities. A little bit more about the MPC. The Mountain Plains Consortium theme is transportation infrastructure and operations to support sustainable energy development and the safe movement of people and goods. MPC is a competitively selected university transportation center sponsored by the U.S. Department of Transportation through its Research and Innovative Technology Administration. Our topic today is key components and validity in the measurement of safety culture, and it's being presented to us today by Dr. Patrick Sherry, who is with the Denver Transportation Institute, University of Denver. Today's presentation materials will be made available on the LMS as well as on the screen when you guys join today's presentation. The research report and everything else are available on the website as well as will be available on the LMS, where you will also find the recording of today's session. With that, Dr. Sherry, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity, and I want to thank everyone for attending this seminar, and especially for all of your hard work in dealing with our current emergency crisis situation with the virus. Hopefully the information that I provide today will be useful to you in the coming months. The topic of the presentation is safety culture and the development of a measurement tool and the further validation of that tool. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what safety culture is, why safety culture is important, how we can measure it, and then I'm going to talk about how we developed our tool and how we determine the validity of the tool. We'll talk a little bit about the utility and what we can do with this information and possible next steps. Just as by way of introduction, I'm a research professor at the University of Denver with the intermodal transportation focus. The university has had a center for transportation studies, and we've collaborated with North Dakota and the Mountain Plains Consortium for over 15 years. So today we deal with a lot of issues related to safety culture. I'm sure you've heard it in the news and read about it in the literature, and it's become kind of a backdrop as to what affects a number of different incidents or accidents that occur to us here in society. Oftentimes, safety culture is referred to in the context of a lapse or an accident or a catastrophe. And the importance of addressing safety culture, improving safety culture, has become even more significant over the years. So before we get too much further into it, let's talk a little bit about what safety culture is. The term safety culture was actually first used in reference to the Chernobyl disaster, which for those of you who are maybe a little younger, occurred in the 80s and in Russia, and it was referenced the meltdown basically of the Chernobyl nuclear reactor. The term safety culture was found actually in the follow-up post-accident review that a number of scientists conducted after the event occurred. And as you can see from this quote here on the screen, the assembly of characteristics and attitudes in organizations and individuals which establishes that as an overriding priority, nuclear plant safety issues receive the attention warranted by their significance. That was the 1988 Russian definition of safety culture. The Chernobyl accident, incidentally, was quite catastrophic. The officials had to close an area within 30 kilometers of the plant. 115,000 people were evacuated, and later another 200,000 people were evacuated. But the findings of the investigation commission were that the design parameters and characteristics of their reactor on April 26th violated the safety standards and regulations so seriously that it could only be operated in a country where there was an inadequate safety culture. Ultimately, 28 people died, 106 people developed radiation sickness. It was quite devastating. Later on, we came across a number of other accidents in the UK, also in the 80s. What was called the Clapham Junction incident occurred, where a passenger train traveling during rush hour slammed into another train heading for London, and a total of 35 people were killed and 484 people were injured. The investigation that followed, which was conducted by Anthony Hidden, it's called the Hidden Report, found that the signaling technician responsible for wiring the tracks had not been told that his working practices were incorrect, and his work had not been inspected. He had also performed the work during his 13th consecutive week of a 7-day work week, of several consecutive 7-day work weeks. Anyway, Hidden described and criticized British Rail. He said, health and safety culture of British Rail contributed to the catastrophe. Essentially, that they were lax and not really attending some of the issues. But more recently, we've had a number of catastrophic rail events. In Canada, the Loch Meontic derailed 72 tank cars full of crude oil. I'm sure those of you in North Dakota were paying attention to that as we were in the height of the movement of oil by rail. But the end result was that the town pretty much burned down. Following the investigation, the safety culture of the railroad was criticized severely, and the poor training of the employees and the lack of proper application of the safety procedures that would have prevented the train from rolling down the hill and derailing in the middle of the town were ignored. Similarly, there was another large derailment on Metro North, the commuter train into New York City, which was also blamed for safety culture. And then there were also fires in 2009 in Washington, D.C. that were the cause of a number of passengers being forced to exit the train in the middle of the track in a tunnel underneath the L'Enfant Plaza station. Again, safety culture was criticized and mentioned as a key contributing factor to the occurrence of these events. I think more recently, we've been hearing about the Boeing 737 MAX, and there is a couple of interesting articles. The one that I've referenced here on the page is reported in the Fifth State. It has a number of interviews of Boeing engineers and officials, but essentially Boeing and McDonnell Douglas merged. Boeing had a wonderful reputation for being a highly safety conscious organization, but McDonnell Douglas was much more of a profit-driven organization. And as you know, there were a couple of very tragic accidents. A number of people were killed in collisions and crashes involving the airplane. But the two or three things related to safety culture, I think, were significant here. One is that the FAA was criticized for farming out the monitoring of safety to external sources. The other was that internally, the culture, and here's a quote from one of the engineers, the downside is that someone can threaten you or your position at work, play ball, or else the managers could tell you to keep your mouth shut or you would lose your job. So there was a lot of pressure on the engineers to perform and to possibly take shortcuts. They also felt that it was the culture and the fact that the senior leadership team, at least from the perception of these individuals, was that there wasn't a sufficient attention to safety. finally, the FAA was admonished and urged to rethink its approach to safety in aviation and approval. I think the other point that I want to make relative to safety culture is to ask you for just a moment to think of a representative image during our current time of the pandemic. And I'm wondering, I'm sure many of you have been watching TV and been thinking about what's going on around the country. And I'm wondering if you can think of and imagine a shall we say, an iconic image that reflects what is going on and how we're reacting to the coronavirus. I'll give you just a second to think about it, because I was thinking about it, and this is what I came up with. I went online and found a number of different images of people, and this was last week, who were basically ignoring the admonition and the request to shelter in place. These pictures were taken on the 20th and the 21st of March. The upper left is a bridge in Boston connecting the Back Bay to Harvard. Over on the right, that's a number of people wandering through the park in Washington, D.C. Down below, on the lower right, that's everybody wandering through Central Park. And on the left, that's one of the beaches in Florida. It's actually not Fort Lauderdale. It's on the other side of the state, not where college students typically go, but where kind of the locals tend to hang out. That's the parking lot there. And as you can see, the place is just packed. So in addition to traffic, aviation, nuclear power accidents, these images, I think, reflect the underlying safety culture that exists within the community and within our country, for that matter. I don't have any pictures of North Dakota or Wyoming of people ignoring the instructions to shelter in place. Perhaps everyone up there is just fine. Anyway, lastly, I think these are other images of what we think of in terms of the safety culture, and I'll come back to this topic of safety culture in hospitals. Notice the gloves, the masks, and everything like that. Very iconic images for our current situation. So we've talked about safety culture. We have this idea that it's something that affects the way that we deal with the potential for accidents and injuries, catastrophic events. But as you can see from the images, it's different in different situations, different industries, different circumstances. And the importance of coming up with a common definition so that we can all talk about it and work with it is what I consider to be the key issue here. So the idea of culture influencing behavior has been around for over 50, 60 years. Margaret Mead, Kurt Levine, Edgar Schein, James Reason, these are academics and theoreticians who talked about the importance of how culture influences our behavior. And definitions of corporate culture have been offered by a number of different scientists and academics. As you can see, the culture is a powerful yet ill-defined conceptual thinking within an organization that expresses organizational values, ideals, attitudes, and beliefs. Essentially, culture is that sum total of ideas and images and common shared practices that people in an organization utilize and carry with them as they go about their day-to-day activities. Learned behaviors, the values and ideals that are characteristic of a particular society or population is another definition of the term. And there's many different definitions, and you can look at them in the full report. But the idea that I want you to take away from our talk today is values, ideals, attitudes, and beliefs. Those are the key components, and they are the essentially the facets of safety culture that we need to somehow tap into. One more image, I think, is helpful. That's the image of an iceberg. You can see the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg is floating above the surface of the water. But down below is the rest of the iceberg, the rest of the culture, if you will. So you'll often hear people talking about safety climate, safety culture. Safety climate are the indicators, I believe, of the underlying safety culture. Safety climate is the way people talk about safety, the way they respond to their PPE or their supervisor or the safety signs you see floating around or seat belts. But the underlying safety culture are the shared values, ideas, beliefs, attitudes, and perception that make up the way we view the entire situation. So what is safety culture? Ultimately, in a nutshell, it's how we do things around here, how we behave. Some people say it's how we behave when nobody is looking. And when you think no one is looking over your shoulder. And that is what we really want to happen. So to look at some of the more formal definitions of safety culture, the European Union has given us a definition of safety culture. It's about the safety management system. And what the key phrase in this definition is the fact that they talk about the integration or the interaction of the system, meaning the rules, the regulations, the procedures, then the attitudes, beliefs, and values of the people in the system as it affects decision and behavior. And I think the great thing about the European Union definition is that they offer a specific instruction here about what a positive safety culture is or a good culture. And it's a shared collective commitment by leaders and individuals to always act safely, in particular when confronting competing goals. Now that's really, I think, one of the other key things that some of the previous academics hadn't really referred to, and that is, and we see that in the examples, Boeing example, for example, in the Boeing 737 MAX accidents, the competition between profit and safety, I think, reflects this competing goal. Both are important. How do you deal with it? So that's the European Union definition. And in the next slide, we have a picture of the facets that they include in their definition of safety culture. They have an inquiring culture, an integrated culture, everybody's involved, a sensible balance between safety and the rules, constant attention to technical barriers and the human factors, management and leadership commitment, just culture, that's fairness, meaning that safety is applied consistently and fairly, rules are applied consistently and fairly, discipline procedures, training procedures are applied consistently and fairly, but most importantly, a shared awareness of the importance of the risks involved. So, on my next slide here, the UK also offered a definition of safety culture, and again, it's a commitment to the organization's health and safety management. But let's jump ahead here to the next slide, which takes us into other definitions that I think are important and that have been adopted by the USDOT. The USDOT put together a committee a few years back, and they worked for, I think, a couple of years to try to come up with the 10 key points they included in their safety culture definition. The 10 points, as you can see, are leadership is clearly committed to safety. Effective communication takes place on a regular basis. Employees feel responsible for safety. think that is a very important one when thinking about safety culture, organizational culture. It's one thing to have a policy manual. It's another thing to note whether or not the members of the organization feel that it's their responsibility to behave or to act on those principles and policies. The work environment is characterized by continuous learning, which, in my opinion, is about root cause analysis, trying to figure it out, what's going on, what's happening, how are these occurring, what's the data telling us. That continuous learning attitude is critical, I think, to developing and to maintaining and to characterizing a positive safety culture. The work environment has a high degree of attention on safety. It's safety conscious. The reporting systems in a organization are not used to punish employees. Those of you who are familiar with OSHA know that that's an important consideration, that safety rules, safety procedures should not be used to punish employees unfairly or unjustly. Number 7 goes back to my pet peeve, which is that safety is prioritized over competing demands. How do you make a decision? One of the early NTSB reports on aviation safety relative to fatigue documented the American Airlines flight that crash landed, I think, in Dallas, ran off the runway, killed 11 people. And some of the surviving members of the crew were interviewed, and one of their key comments was, we'd been working all day, we wanted to get home to our families. And they decided to go ahead and risk it and land in a thunderstorm, lightning storm, which took out their navigation system as they were trying to land. The other, so that gives you, I think, an indication of how competing demands aren't necessarily just profit-driven, but personally driven in terms of making decisions about how to take certain actions or not. So competing demands, mutual trust, fair and consistent application, and finally, number 10, the consistent support for training and providing the necessary resources to behave safely. The one other key point in understanding safety culture, I think, in addition to these definitions, is that safety culture can exist also within subcultures. And you'll see this when I get to some of the data that we gathered, that even within an organization, subunits of the organization can have their own view of safety. Some units may be highly attentive to certain aspects of safety culture, while others may be a little bit more or less, shall we say, particular about aspects of safety culture. So this notion of subcultures or work groups within an organization that have slightly different norms or different ways of acting on the culture is very important as well. So what are the benefits of thinking about and studying safety culture? Well, I think you can see from the examples of accidents that I shared with you that it can lead to, the safety culture can lead to the adoption of attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. It can lead to the development of a code of conduct, and it can fill gaps in knowledge, filling gaps and blank, meaning when there is no rule for how to behave in a particular situation, oftentimes the safety culture can allow people to generate their own response, and hopefully it's a positive response. For example, there was an incident here in Denver a couple of years back where there was a freight train that somehow hadn't been properly fixed with the handbrakes, and it rolled out of the yard and down the hill slowly, but was about to run into a crossing here in Denver. I forget what street it was on. Nevertheless, the important thing is that a crewman, an employee working on the side of the train, ran after the train down the hill, jumped up on the train, and while he's hanging on to the side of the car with one hand, he was cranking the handbrake with the other, trying to slow this thing down. Now, on the one hand, you can argue that, wow, that's great. Here's this guy. He's behaving really safely, or he's trying to prevent accidents and save lives. But in fact, he was admonished much, much later for not following the safety procedures, which is never to jump on moving equipment. I mean, he could have fallen off. He could have fallen under the wheels. He could have gotten seriously injured. So, I mean, that is kind of the example of the competing goals. How do you behave in situations like that? Clearly, he was a hero, but at the same time, he was engaging in very risky and somewhat unsafe behavior. So the safety culture can help people fill in gaps. They can increase motivation. They can help people identify areas that are associated with needing remediation. They can influence the effectiveness of your safety practices. Unfortunately, they can sometimes inhibit the effects of other interventions by focusing on certain ways of viewing safety culture. And finally, the most, I think, important aspect of safety culture for people like us who are on the sidelines, if you will, who are trying to influence human behavior, is that safety culture can be changed through interventions. We can do things. We as educators, professionals, officials, managers and whatnot can influence how safety culture actually occurs and emerges. Finally, it's important to recognize that safety culture does really affect performance, not just in terms of safety, but culture has been shown to influence significantly the profits of various corporations. Even in a sales organization, the culture of that particular unit can be related to the sales numbers, sales ratios. So it's a powerful concept and phenomenon. So I'm kind of summarizing here that what we're looking at is safety culture. We want to pay attention to safety culture because it has a number of benefits. It can influence profits. It can influence profitability. It can influence workplace accidents. And there is some emerging data showing us that the impact of safety culture can influence the number of accidents occurs. And this refers to both individual accidents, when individuals might commit an error or a behavior that might not be as desirable as others, but also in terms of organizational accidents, where multiple systems come into play to influence behavior. So it's both an individual, it has an impact on both individuals and the organization as a whole. I'm sure those of you who studied safety are aware of Reason's philosophy and his Swiss cheese model. I view safety culture as the space between those pieces of Swiss cheese and how that influences the way or the path that a set of behaviors take to get into or to emerge as an accident or an event. Some data. Let's talk a little bit about data. The research data is starting to be more prevalent. A gentleman, a professor by the name of Wang, studied safety climate in 33 companies, where safety climate is the indicator of safety culture, and they found lower workplace injury rates when they were analyzing work compensation claims, but they used regression analysis to test the predictability of a measure of safety climate on injury rates controlling for differences in hazard across various various industries. So the findings showed that the level of safety climate measures were negatively associated with injury rates, meaning with the stronger and more positive the scores on the safety climate measure, the lower the injury rates. Similarly, there was another study by Zohar in 2000, and Zohar is considered the sort of the pioneer of this kind of research, found a significant correlation, a link between safety climate perceptions and objective injury data. He called them micro accidents in manufacturing plants, things like, smashing your finger, cutting your hand, stubbing your toe. Not catastrophic accidents, but minor accidents, quote unquote, over a 5-month period. And the regression analysis here shows the correlation or the significance of the predictors of taking certain actions that were measured by the safety climate measure and the expectations of the participants or the members of the organization in expecting certain safe behaviors. The measures on these two scales were significantly correlated. That's what these little asterisks indicate. Significantly correlated with a reduction in workplace injury. Going back to hospitals, there was a study, again, not too long ago, 2014, I believe, 2010 perhaps, that looked at ICUs across the country. I put this slide in, given the fact that we're all kind of paying attention to what's going on with our hospital and our healthcare system. ICUs across the country, 30 of them were invited to participate in a study of safety and operational incidents in the healthcare system. They adapted, interestingly enough, a measure that had been used to develop or to measure workplace climate in airline pilot cockpits. So they changed some of the names, some of the wording in this scale from, how do you talk to your co-pilot to like how do you talk to your nurse or your anesthesiologist or whatever in an ICU. So using that cockpit management questionnaire, they developed a 60-item questionnaire using a 5-point Likert scale, strongly agree, strongly disagree. So then they went back, and after they had the participants from these 30 different ICUs take these questionnaires, they went back and analyzed the safety culture items, and they correlated them with the percentage of fatalities that occurred in the, subsequent to being in the ICU. And they corrected it for, number of expected fatalities due to the natural progression of these diseases. But as you can see, that using the hierarchical model, the linear model that they employed, they were able to demonstrate that for a 10% decrease in the positive perceptions, in other words, for a safety culture that wasn't as positive as the ideal, they were able to demonstrate a significant increase in the odds of death. The likelihood of the odds of death in an ICU increased. Now, this is not a huge number, but when we're talking about death in ICUs, the odds are 1.24 to 1 that a death or a fatality is more likely to occur post-ICU as a result of a negative change in the score on the safety culture measure that they developed, I should say that they adapted. Interestingly enough, they were also looking at length of stay. Again, significant decreases in the safety climate perceptions by the staff and personnel of the ICUs resulted in a increase in the length of stay, the average length of stay of ICU patients. So we're seeing some connection here, even in non-transportation settings, using the safety climate concept to tackle the underlying safety, to assess, I should say, underlying safety culture. So I concluded then that we need a good metric. The problem, I think, is that everybody, if you look at the studies, you look at the information, it's clear that we need a good metric to be able to manage against. As Peter Drucker, the renowned management theoretician and consultant, has said, you can't manage what you can't measure. And unless we have a yardstick that we can apply in a number of different situations, it's going to be difficult, I think, to have any consistency and have a clear policy, especially from a state level or from a higher organization level, if you're not using the same metric across cultures and organizations. It's difficult, I believe, to be able to know what is helping and what isn't helping. So our team here at the University of Denver decided to tackle this, and first, like any good set of academics and researchers, we wanted to make sure that we reviewed the literature to see if there was a good measure out there that we could use that would be helpful to use across transportation settings. We found a number of different things. Frankly, most everyone is either developing their own, like the study of the ICUs, or they're adapting some other measure that wasn't really created for that particular setting. The commuter rail in Washington, D.C. hired an accounting company to create a measurement tool that they then used to determine the safety culture of their work crews. I took a look at it. It was interesting, but didn't really tackle a lot of the key issues. So two things. One, there's no standard metric. Measurement tools are dissimilar. There's not enough norming, meaning there's not a standard yardstick or metric which to compare. Where are we placing the bar, essentially, in order to be able to help us as managers and consultants to deal with the level, the extent of the safety culture that we see in a particular organization. So we did find that there are a number of organizational inventories out there, the Denison Organizational Culture Survey, the Safety Culture Survey, but again, they publish these surveys, you can find them on the web, but they don't have any reliability or validity data so that you know how accurate they are, how good they are at detecting problems in the organization. The Safety Culture Values Questionnaire, I found, it's based primarily on their theory, but and measures values, but no other aspect of safety culture. Absence is any reliability or validity data. So there are some other measures without published psychometrics. Again, they're hard to evaluate, hard to get your hands on, and so we decided we needed to make our own. But something that would be used in a variety of different settings, that would get at values, beliefs, and attitudes, that would get at behavioral expectations and practices, and also assess the key facets of culture. Remember that slide I showed you from the USDOT, the key facets of culture, they need to be measured in a safety culture measure. So our model, our underlying model of safety culture looks at meaning, values, beliefs, and expectations, and we are trying to assess these different aspects of safety culture. In addition to a questionnaire, I just want to make a caveat here, a note, that it's important to also gather observational data using interviews, reviewing published materials, and observing workplace activities. However, the purpose of this particular presentation is on the measurement tool itself. Once again, here's the USDOT elements of safety culture, the facets of safety culture that we think are important and which guide us. So based on our review of the literature, the identification of the gaps, the lack of a standard tool, we approached the Colorado Department of Transportation and said, hey, you want to do a study of safety culture? And we were given the opportunity of utilizing our experimental measure with them a couple of years ago. Most of the participants were not managers. They did engage in high-risk jobs, even though everybody in the organization took it, selected the people not necessarily in the finance department, but driving trucks, doing construction, managing high-risk activities. And we also obtained a cross-validation sample, which I'll get to later, from a group of 600 people in a large East Coast transportation company. We developed the items for this scale by doing a number of focus groups and inspecting other instruments and essentially utilizing the theory that we had referred to earlier. We came up with an item pool of about 75 to 100 items initially. And we want to thank the Colorado Department of Transportation for allowing their members to complete the lengthy survey. So the survey was administered to 1,900 plus USDOT employees, and 970 cases, or about half the questionnaires, were thought to then be usable for analyses. We then conducted a factor analysis, and then we looked at a second data set. So just so you know, the observation guide that we used looked at a number of these dimensions and was used to help us understand and supplement our thinking about the items that we used and administered and the information gathered. This would be a topic, a whole other topic of another conversation, so I'm going to not get into that. But I said we did a factor analysis. What's a factor analysis? So a factor analysis is like, let's suppose we were selling beer for Coors, and or Budweiser or Miller or whoever, and we wanted to find out what was the most important factor that people were using in their decision to rate a particular beer. So beer is, it's fizzy, or it's hoppy, or it's sweet, or it's acidic. So all of those different factors are the underlying factors that people will use to understand or to make a decision. Similarly, with safety culture, when we looked at all of our 100 items, we sorted them using a factor analytic technique to see which ones were most related to each other, and we came up with 10 basic categories of items. And these are reflected here on the slide, ranging from management commitment, safety practices, and so on and so forth. And going back to my comment about beer, when you take a drink of beer or soda or sparkling water, whatever it is, what jumps out at you, or shall I say, what is the factor that influences your perception of this particular substance the most? Well, similarly, with safety culture, what is the factor that takes into account the majority of people's beliefs? And as you can see from our analyses, the factor analysis revealed that just about half of what we call the variance or the noise within this concept of safety culture, meaning the items, were related to the underlying factor of management commitment. And this in particular is the commitment of your immediate manager, whoever you consider to be your immediate boss, not the guy or the woman that sits in the, at the top of the pyramid, but the immediate manager. The second factor that accounted for the next largest amount of variance in the factor analysis was personal responsibility, followed by the commitment of your peers and coworkers to behaving safely, to acting safely, and then senior management commitment. Remember my pet peeve about making a decision in the face of goals? That is the issue of safety versus productivity. That accounted for the next highest level of variance or noise related to the overriding construct of safety culture. So in constructing a questionnaire or an instrument, this is one way of validating an instrument. By that I mean we called it a safety culture measure, then we factor analyzed it, and our results confirmed the theory from the previous slides. Remember back here when I was talking about what the DOT wanted? Our analysis confirms the majority of the concepts in this 10-point list and is reflected in the percentage of variance accounted for by the various items. And while not a one-to-one correspondence with the USDOT list, this in fact is a more scientific representation of the underlying factor structure of safety culture. So if you ask me, what is safety culture? Our research suggests that these 10 components make up safety culture, and the instrument that we have measures these components. The other thing, I already talked about the observation targets. One other thing that you should be asking is, okay, so Professor Sherry says he's developed a yardstick. Well, what kind of a yardstick is it? By that I mean, how reliable is it? So when you go out there to measure the pavement or to cut a section of rail or to put up a building, you're probably going to measure it with something, a yardstick. Well, you're not going to use a rubber yardstick or a liquid yardstick. You're going to use, a firm wooden yardstick, or a metal yardstick, or some highly reliable metric that is going to assure you that if you measure it on Tuesday when the sun is out, that your yardstick is the same length when you measure it next week when it's 32 degrees below zero. So the point I'm making is these scales that we identified through our factor analysis were then reanalyzed to determine their reliability, meaning do they measure the same thing reliably over time? And I have a whole list of numbers that I can show you, but in the interest of time, I'll skip that and say we were able to demonstrate the reliability, meaning the consistent internal consistency of these scales to acceptable psychometric standards. So then what about the validity of it? So what if we measure it? So what if we measure safety culture? Well, we can't obviously wait, or we can't say, okay, let's have a catastrophic accident and see if the safety culture measure told us what was happening. Can't do that. So what can we do? We couldn't, in the case of the CDOT, go back and inspect their personnel files, but we were able to get self-report data on whether or not people had been involved in near misses. And by comparing the people who had or had not been involved in near misses, we were able to see that there were significant differences between the blue line and the red line on the measures of the safety culture and being included or not included in the group of employees who had or hadn't been involved in a near miss. So in other words, the average score on our safety culture scale was 1 on the left, the y-axis being low, 5 on the y-axis high, indicates that lower scores on the safety culture scale were reflective of and more likely to indicate the probability of being involved in or reporting a near-miss incident. We replicated this on our 600 member organization from the East Coast, and we found similar results. Interestingly, one of the more revealing significant differences is in the area of personal responsibility. Doesn't look exactly like that, the scale, but personal responsibility was a significant predictor. We also looked at whether or not people had been reprimanded for safe or unsafe acts. And again, we found a significant difference with management commitment, not such a significant difference with personal responsibility, but the other scales held up here. Notice that people who reported lower levels on the of engagement in safety practices were less likely to be included in the safe group. They were, in fact, in the unsafe act. A significant difference here. So again, validation of the utility of the instrument in differentiating between persons who had been identified or written up, if you will, for safe or unsafe acts. We looked at also risk ratios of components of our measure and found that there were significant increases in the likelihood of near misses, number of accidents, and number of injuries based on our subscales. The odds ratio and relative risk increased as poor or non-positive aspects of safety culture were assessed. Essentially, getting lower scores on our different safety culture subscales resulted in higher odds of being involved in a near miss, reporting higher numbers of accidents, number of injuries, and that the relative risk also increased the lower the scores on these scales. So the safety culture attitude scale or assessment scale enables us to improve the likelihood that we're going to be able to identify people who are likely to be involved in near misses, reporting accidents, and reporting injuries. Remember, I talked about differences between organizations. So this reflects the data that we've collected at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different organizations over the last 5 years. And as you can see, the safety culture scores, which reflect the averages of our safety factors being shown here along the bottom, which are the same as these components up here. These are the facets of our safety culture measure. So I wanted to show you that we can compare organizations to each other and use a comparative yardstick and say, hey, what's the likelihood or how do you stack up against another organization in terms of your safety culture? Now, this heavy dark line is the average across all the organizations, and these are code words to protect the identity of the different organizations and maintain their confidentiality. But interestingly, without revealing who or what, the organization with the highest score on our safety culture measure was obtained by a maritime shipping organization that operates about 30 different ships globally. And they invited us to study their organization after they'd been engaged in a multi-year effort to improve safety culture. So we also have a bus transit company and a couple of railroads. So interestingly, the railroads are at the bottom and the other two are at the top. So, but we're able to then talk with and interpret the results and say, here are some areas that you might want to focus on. These lower scores here would be areas that they would want to focus on to try to improve their safety culture. This is a similar chart. We also then look at subunits or departments. This was another organization that had a transportation and mechanical and engineering department. Here's the engineering department, and here is the transportation department, and here is the mechanical department in this case. So we could compare the subcultures or the subgroups within an organization as well. So in the handout here, I've included definitions of the safety culture subscales of our instrument. And at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions. And you'll have to wait until our next seminar to see what our recommendations are about how to implement these the information from these scales in a more systematic, proactive way. But I believe I've shown you, as a result of the data that we've collected, that the instrument that we've developed does have a significant ability to differentiate on 3 different metrics of reported injuries, near misses, accidents, and being involved in safe or unsafe acts. So with that, I will thank you all for your attention and conclude. And I don't know if Chris has gathered any questions or comments that people want to ask.
Thank you for that. No, there are no questions that came in, none that I see anyway in either the Q&A or the chat. So thank you for sharing this information and research. I think all very, very valuable information that can definitely be used or at least considered when looking at the safety initiatives or the safety programs that each states are more than likely looking at, depending on what scenario or anything else they're working on. So really good information, so thank you for that. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and chime in through the Q&A or again through the chat window, and we'll make sure that we address those right away. If not, thank you everyone for your time and attention today. Go to the Transportation Learning Network website at translearning.org, and then you can see those upcoming learning opportunities. There you will also be able to access the learning management system, where you will find today's presentation as a recording, as well as the research documentation and other resources available to you, and to sign up for future sessions as well. With that, again, Dr. Sherry, thank you very much for sharing this research with us today. Thank you guys for your time and attention. Everybody have a safe day, stay healthy, and stay clean. We'll talk to you guys soon.